They say this place is west of Lost and north of nowhere. But long ago, more than 40 years ago, something fell to earth here. And soon, people from London to Los Angeles had heard about this sheep ranch in the desert northwest of Roswell, New Mexico. It happened in 1947. Today, it is still a mystery, still a question mark. Or is it? Has someone hidden the answer somewhere and kept it secret all these years? That summer in 1947, the world was recovering from history's most terrible war. Yet, it would be fair to say that, for Americans at least, things were getting back to normal. Normal. Now, there's an interesting word. In June of 1947, Ken Arnold, a businessman, was piloting his private plane near Washington State's Mount Rainier when he spotted something not normal. Later, he described the 9 objects as a group of discs that skipped across the sky like flying saucers. The newspapers liked that. Flying saucers. The name stuck. And soon it seemed more newspapers were writing about flying saucers, the more people were seeing flying saucers. Here in New Mexico, in June and July of 1947, there were multiple sightings of the discs, or flying saucers, if you will. Maybe they really saw them, maybe not. And even if they did, maybe the lights were just reflections, or something caused by nature, like heat waves or mirages. But if not, if the lights were aircraft, then whose aircraft? And what brought them here? Why New Mexico? It was an event that damaged the whole world. Everyone. Because since that first bomb fell on Hiroshima, no one has been safe. Not on Earth. So it was predictable that when those flying discs appeared, the U.S. military suspected the Russians. But others had a different theory. As the poet John Donne wrote, "No man is an island." Perhaps, they reasoned, neither is this planet. Did the shock waves of those first atomic blasts, they wondered, travel far across the ocean of space? And out there was something listening. The first atomic bomb was tested, set off, in the New Mexico desert near Alamogordo, about 100 miles southwest of here. That was July 16th of 1945, about 2 years before the first reported sightings of the flying discs. After the war, weapons and rocket research continued at Alamogordo and in a region nearby called White Sands.
This looks like the Sahara, but it's not. It looks like sand, but it's not. What you see are dunes of white gypsum. And not far from this natural illusion is another deceptive place, the top-secret White Sands Missile Range. After World War II, the United States brought more than 100 German scientists to Fort Bliss near El Paso, Texas, about 2 hours' drive from here, and put them to work designing rockets. Their leader was the late Dr. Wernher von Braun. On April 16, 1946, the first American adaptation of a German V-2 rocket was launched from White Sands Proving Ground. Other V-2 rockets were successfully launched that year on June 13th, October 10th, and the 17th of December. The December flight reached an altitude of 116 miles. Meanwhile, in Roswell, New Mexico, the world's only nuclear strike force maintained a state of constant readiness. With 15 atom bombs in its arsenal, it was the United States Army Air Corps' 509th Bomb Group. If you look at the map, you see this: 3 locations in the rough shape of a triangle. At the bottom left corner, the missile range. At the bottom right, Roswell Army Airfield, headquarters of the 509th and its nuclear arsenal. And at the top of the triangle, the site of the mysterious crash, July 2nd, 1947.
So what came down out here? An enemy reconnaissance flight? The U-2-like crash of a Russian plane? Well, that theory would soon evaporate. The Army, Air Force, and yes, the Pentagon moved fast to come up with another story. We know that now. And there is convincing evidence the official story was false. Out in this wide open space, in the high desert of Lincoln County, the sky is as vast as the land. The wind blows, sheep graze, and time seems patient and stoic, like the eyes of an old Indian. A ranch hand by the name of Mac Brazel lived and worked out here. On the morning of July 3rd, he found it. In a pattern perhaps 3/4 of a mile long and 250 feet wide was a scattering of pieces of things. They had fallen everywhere, landing on the wet sand and in sinkholes filled with rainwater. On the night before, a violent thunderstorm had broken over the desert. But Mac Brazel remembered hearing one thunderclap louder than all the rest, almost too loud for thunder. Now, looking at the wreckage that littered the desert, he wondered, was it thunder or was it an explosion? There were scraps of metal and other lightweight material like foil. There was fiber or string, and there were slender sticks suggesting structural beams. On these sticks, he saw markings that reminded him of symbols scratched in clay by Indians. Petroglyphs, they're called. That's how they looked to Mac Brazel. Others who would see them later compared them to Egyptian hieroglyphics. Mac would remember that the debris was so deeply packed, the sheep would refuse to cross the field. He had to herd them around it. Water that was more than a mile away. He gathered up some of the pieces and took them to the house of his nearest neighbors, Floyd and Loretta Proctor.
He described the stuff to us, and we advised him to, come to Roswell and report it. We'd heard that, there's a reward for UFOs. And we call them flying saucers.
That evening, after his visit with Loretta Proctor, Mac would return to the debris field. According to his son Bill, Mac then brought a large chunk of the debris to this livestock shed. The shed is about 3 miles north of the crash site, still here after almost 50 years. That was the origin of early reports that a rancher had found a flying saucer and stored it in his barn. Mac still had work to do. The next 2 days, on the 4th and 5th of July, he tended the sheep. Then, on the 6th of July, he got up early, finished his chores, and drove into Roswell.
Mac's first stop was the sheriff's office. After that, things happened fast.
Sheriff George Wilcox sent 2 deputies out to the ranch and telephoned the 509th Bomb Group at Roswell Army Airfield. In no time, the 509th's Air Intelligence Officer, Major Jesse Marcel, arrived at the sheriff's office. With him was a counterintelligence agent dressed in civilian clothing. Major Marcel telephoned the commander of the 509th, Colonel William Blanchard. The colonel then ordered Marcel and the counterintelligence agent to go out to the ranch with Brazel and investigate.
The road was no better then than now, and because of that, it was after dark by the time they got there. Meantime, the sheriff's 2 deputies returned to Roswell with a story of their own. They had missed the debris field, they said, but instead found this, a circle in a pasture where the sand had been melted to glass.
Bigger than a football field, a huge area, a huge circle that had been burnt.
The major, the rancher, and the counterintelligence agent spent the night at the range hut. Sometime later that evening, Major Marcel came out here to the cattle shed and used a Geiger counter to check the piece of wreckage that Mac had stored. There was no indication it was radioactive. The following day, July 7th, they collected all the debris they could load into the Major's Buick and the Army truck. Then, about dusk, they started back to Roswell. Over the years, many investigators have tried to solve the riddle of the Roswell crash. In 1980, co-authors Charles Berlitz and William Moore presented their findings in a book called The Roswell Incident. 10 years later, tantalizing new facts were uncovered in research by Don Schmidt and Kevin Randall. Don is Director of Special Investigations for the Center for UFO Studies in Chicago. Kevin is an intelligence officer, a captain in the United States Air Force Reserve. Their book, UFO Crash at Roswell, adds important pieces to the unfinished puzzle.
Don and Kevin were the first team of authors ever to conduct a scientific investigation of the crash sites. They agreed to join us here in Corona, New Mexico. As for another first, we brought television cameras to the crash sites. They guided us traveling cross-country over rough terrain without roads. We entered the old Brazel Ranch from the far side, coming down toward the crash sites from the northwest. If ever a place was perfect to keep a secret, this was it.
Early September of 1989, the Center for UFO Studies sponsored the first archaeological dig at the actual Roswell crash site. We took a team of 10 people, 3 scientists, 2 with archaeological backgrounds, 2 from the National Laboratory. We concentrated not only on the debris field itself, but on the outlying areas. We still have hopes that because of caves, a 700-foot well, other downside fence lines, that we may find something.
Investigators Schmidt and Randall have determined that almost from the very beginning, Colonel Blanchard and members of his staff were convinced that somewhere in the desert was the crew of the downed craft, possibly still alive. On the afternoon of July 8th, Mac Brazel was flown over the ranch in a military aircraft, assisting officers in their search for surviving crew members or their bodies. As part of his research, Kevin Randall already had retraced that flight. We asked him to go back, this time with one of our cameras aboard.
As near as we can determine, on July 8th, the 509th Bomb Group initiated an aerial reconnaissance. What they were trying to do is find the rest of the craft. They suspected there would be more of the craft there than just the debris field. The aerial reconnaissance was an idea to find that. Mac Brazel was in the aircraft with them, the thought being that Brazel, as a rancher, would be familiar with the landmarks, and if they did locate any more of the craft, he could direct them directly to the site. The craft came up off the debris field after leaving the gouge, gained a little bit of altitude.
Kevin is convinced the craft stayed in the air a few more seconds after the explosion. It flew about 3 miles, then crashed at the base of those rock cliffs you see below. We call it the impact point. Ironically, it was a group of civilians who reached it first.
We have descriptions of the second crash site from 3 separate sources: a civil engineer, an archaeologist, and a soldier. All claim to be eyewitnesses. We think the search plane with Mac Brazel aboard spotted it too. According to all accounts, and they are strikingly similar, this was the scene. An aircraft shaped like a disc had crash-landed. Lying on the ground beside it were several bodies, humanoid but small, perhaps only 4 or 5 feet tall. They were very thin and their heads looked too large for their bodies, at least by human standards. To reconstruct what happened the night of July 2nd, 1947, investigators Randall and Schmidt have developed a theory that explains all 3 locations: the debris field, the circle of melted sand, and this location where the saucer and its crew are said to have been found. Flying through the storm, the ship malfunctions. It descends and either lands or skips along the ground. Intense heat from the craft melts the sand to glass. Back in the air again, it flies only a few more miles, still in trouble. Then, crippled, the ship travels perhaps 2 miles beyond the debris field. A voyage light years across space ends in the New Mexico desert. For the crew, injured and stranded, death is inevitable.
On July 8th, the day the second crash site was found, things started rapidly to unravel. The first soldiers to reach the disk discovered civilians had gotten there ahead of them. And back at the base, the phones started ringing and wouldn't stop. The world was electrified by an official press release. It announced the 509th had recovered a flying disc. Walter Hart still lives in Roswell. He settled there after resigning his commission in the Air Force. First Lieutenant Hott was Public Information Officer of the 509th. This is the substance of the press release that he wrote. Soon the lieutenant would be blamed for jumping the gun and portrayed as an eager beaver.
I think that not only was I set up, but I think Colonel Blanchard was also. About the only reason that I can think of is they wanted to cover up the story and keep all this information confidential.
Tuesday morning, the 8th of July, Major Marcel, the intelligence officer, reported to the commander of the 509th Bomb Group, Colonel William Blanchard. Colonel Blanchard ordered the provost marshal to surround the debris field and to post guards sealing off all roads leading into the crash site. Then Colonel Blanchard reported to 8th Air Force headquarters in Fort Worth. And soon the Pentagon set a flight with a special team of agents from Washington to Roswell. Later that morning, about 11 o'clock, Lieutenant Hott finished the press release. He would drop off copies at both Roswell's daily newspapers and at both the radio stations in town.
Every news bureau subscribes to wire services, like the Associated Press, Reuters, or United Press International. Nowadays, at the Roswell Daily Record, bulletins come in over computers instead of teletype machines. But even in 1947, the word could be flashed from Roswell around the world in minutes. And that's exactly what happened. By noon, July 8th, every telephone line into Roswell, New Mexico was jammed. At the 509th, Colonel Blanchard himself couldn't place an outside call. It was impossible.
By 4 o'clock that afternoon, Mac Brazel was back in Roswell after helping out in the air search that found the second crash site. The next thing that happened was a classic military Mac Brazel. But Walt Whitmore, an owner of station KGFL in Roswell, found him. We get more on that from Judd Roberts.
But he found him, and he suggested that they go out to Whit's house, which was on the extreme side of Roswell at that time. And we felt that it would give us an opportunity to get some information, which we would like to have had. As someone said one time, you sequestered him or you hid him out, but I'd like more politely to say we offered him a place to stay that night so he could get away from a lot of people with questions.
With calls still pouring in from as far away as London and Hong Kong, the Roswell Daily Record hit the street with a front-page banner headline. The newspaper based its story on Lieutenant Hott's press release. But, as we know now, more than 40 years later, the media was about to be sealed off from the facts and spoon-fed an alibi.
Army officers found Mac Brazel and put him under house arrest. Hours of intense grilling would follow, and he was subjected to a complete physical examination. Then on July 9th, at radio station KGFL, Walt Whitmore got a special telephone call from Washington. He was ordered not to broadcast his recorded interview with Mac Brazel.
The suggestion was made to us that if we wanted to keep our license, we would not use the interview on the air because that would give us about 24 hours to find something else to do beside the radio business.
Next, Army officers searched all the radio stations and newspapers in Roswell. They seized all copies of the press release and anything else they could find that pertained to the story. Then, on July 9th, Mac Brazel, escorted by officers, turned up at radio station KGFL with a brand new story, not at all like the one he told Walt Whitmore while in hiding. For centuries, the Indians of New Mexico worshiped the sun, the giver of life, gatekeeper to the vaults of heaven. It was to learn more about ancient Indian culture that a group of archaeologists came to the desert on the morning of July 8th, 1947.
The human factor is important. People won't keep silent forever. But of the handful of witnesses who eventually talked about what they saw here at the second crash site, most are dead now, victims of illness or old age. We can only take note of who they were, how different they were, and yet how they all describe seeing the same things. An aircraft apparently not made on Earth, and creatures who looked as if they had not been born on this planet. Once the military found the second crash site, they moved fast. From the plane, in which he was a passenger, Mac Brazel helped guide the troops on the ground who were closing in. But before the military could get here, a civil engineer surveying for an irrigation project came upon the site by accident. His name was Grady Barnett, by all accounts a no-nonsense fellow. Barnett's close friend, Vern Maltese, remembers Barney telling him about finding the bodies and how he described them.
He said, well, I'm going to tell you something that I'm not supposed to divulge. And he come across this object on the ground, which was the shape of a flying saucer, and it hadn't split open. So he jumped out of his pickup and went down there, and there was 4 beings laying on the ground. And they were in a sort of a silver-colored suit, and they were about 3 to 4 feet high. And the suits were rather tight-fitting, and they had covering, except there was no covering on the head or none on the hands. And the shape of the heads of the beings on the ground were hairless with a sort of a pear-shaped head, and the hands were exposed. And they had just barely arrived, and there was an archaeology team that had just come up there about the same, just a little bit after Barney. And then the military come in and surrounded the area, and they called all those people that were there from the archaeology team and Mr. Barnett, and they briefed them that this was not to be divulged to anybody, that they were not to say one word about it and forget they'd ever seen anything.
Barnett said he was standing beside the bodies, close enough to touch them, when the group of archaeologists and students arrived. If the story is true, then here is an excellent group of qualified witnesses in possession of material evidence. In other words, here was proof. But what happened? In no time, the military took charge. They covered the bodies. They herded the archaeologists, the students, and the engineer off to one side and made them face in the opposite direction. This was a matter of national security. They were not to talk about it. If any of them did, the government would hear about it, and the government would know how to find them. Soldiers escorted them away from the site and into obscurity. Grady Barnett did tell his boss about the bodies, but the response was ridicule and a common barnyard expletive. After that, Barnett kept most of the details to himself, speaking only to family members and his close friend Vern Maltese. Barnett died in 1969. The archaeologists and the students dropped out of sight, presumably returning to a large northeastern university. For years, no one knew where to find them. Then in 1975, a woman suffering from cancer made a deathbed statement to a nurse at St. Petersburg Community Hospital in Florida.
When I was a nurse on a terminally ill floor, we had a patient who was admitted, and one day I went in to bathe this patient, and she was more alert than she usually was. She was very suspicious acting. She asked me if I could draw the curtain. She wanted to know if there was another patient in the other bed, and I said no, which I was a little surprised because she wasn't so alert. In fact, most things that she did was call out one particular name. So she proceeded to talk to me, and she said there's something that she needs to talk to someone about, that she needed to tell them something. She said, I've held it in a long time. And then she said that a lot of years ago she was out with a bunch of people, and they were, she said, rock hunting. And she kept saying, I wasn't supposed to be there, but I went. And she goes, and then she said, I wish I hadn't. And she said they were out and they were walking around, and they came upon a hill, and they went over the hill. And she said then they saw a large shiny object. And she said it was very large, and they wanted to see more, so they started walking toward it. She said that when they got there, that there was a large round object, and it was sitting on the ground. And she said, and then on the ground was some, she goes, blankets, or something. And she said that one of the guys from the expedition, one of the men, walked over and they pulled back the covers. And she said there were little people. She couldn't believe it. There were actually little people. She said they had very large heads and very big eyes, and she said they had some kind of shiny material on. And I can't remember if she said what color. I thought she said blue, but I really can't remember at this point. But she said it was so shiny, it was almost like it was fluid-like. And she said, and then she became very upset, and she goes, but you mustn't tell anybody. She goes, never tell anybody. And at this point, she would just keep looking around the room. She was very paranoid acting, and she said, because they can always find you. And I said to her, I said, who can always find you? She goes, the government can always find you.
2 days after Mac Brazel turned up in Roswell, rumors were spreading like brush fire. The public was led to believe the Pentagon was hopping mad, and a general by the name of Roger Ramey was taking flack. Contrary to popular belief, that was the result of a carefully orchestrated cover story. Ramey was commander of the 8th Air Force in Fort Worth, Texas, higher headquarters of the 509th. Even before the 509th started picking up the pieces and looking for the bodies, 8th Air Force headquarters was on the line to the Pentagon. On the morning of July 8th, that special flight was arranged, sending a team of counterintelligence experts from Washington to Roswell Army Airfield. The general and the Pentagon were about to screw the lid down.
Carefully setting up an alibi, General Ramey ordered Colonel Blanchard, the 509th's commander, to send his intelligence officer, Major Marcel, to Fort Worth. Marcel took to the general's office some of the debris packed in a small box. Leaving the box on his desk, the general then led the major into another room, suggesting they look at a map. When they returned, the box had disappeared. In its place was a damaged weather balloon. And reporters. Just a mistake, he announced. Major Marcel and the 509th Bomb Group had goofed. Besides, the general added, this one was a new kind of balloon. It was case closed by mid-afternoon. But we know now that some of the debris already had been delivered to the general earlier that day. If it were nothing but a weather balloon, why did he say so then and there, defuse the situation, and placate the Pentagon? Dr. Jesse Marcel was 11 years old when his father, Major Marcel, came home with a carload of curious objects one night. Dr. Marcel now lives in Helena, Montana. He remembers that his father woke him up about 2 o'clock in the morning, showing him and his mother the things he found.
The thing that set this apart from anything that I had ever seen before or since was the marking zone parts of the wreckage. In the I-beam structural members, there was like a writing of sorts. I remember at the time thinking this was like hieroglyphic, but it wasn't really hieroglyphic, but it was more of geometrical forms and symbols along the inner surface of an I-beam. And they were kind of a metallic purple hue and seemed like they were embossed in the metal itself. And I suppose that is the singular thing that sets us apart from more ordinary debris. I do know it was not a weather balloon or radar target as was proposed by the Air Force. Because I was, even at that young age, I was familiar with things like what a radar target should look like, what a weather balloon certainly would look like. And since they used that as a cover story for this extraordinary debris, I knew that must be something very unusual about that. And so I have come around to the realization that this was out of this world.
In May of 1990, Dr. Marcel agreed to be placed under hypnosis. It was an effort by Don Schmidt and his colleagues to retrieve from the doctor's mind lost memories, to see again clearly the indecipherable symbols on those sticks of debris, the ones that looked like structural beams.
Circle, Bozeman square. Yeah, circle that? Bozeman square. Yes. Is the square inside the circle or outside the circle? It's inside. Inside. What next?
Here at the debris field, while the general was putting out his weather balloon story, teams of men with wheelbarrows were still working. Imagine roadblocks, machine guns, and at least 60 men with trucks to recover a balloon like this. Other weather balloons have been found and turned in by civilians. They were small enough to fit in the trunk of a car. Even the new model referred to by the general would have fit. In fact, Mac Brazel said he knew what weather balloons looked like, that he had found them on the ranch before. Despite military pressure, Mac still would insist that the debris in the field the sheep would not cross was different. And of course, weather balloons don't carry passengers, not even small passengers like the ones supposedly found at the second crash site. Now, back to the rumors that were spreading through Roswell. If bodies really were found, is it true that one of them was still alive?
As part of their 2-year investigation, authors Don Schmidt and Kevin Randall interviewed more than 250 witnesses and sources regarding the Roswell crash. They were careful to avoid hearsay. They weeded out suspect sources, those who might have exaggerated or embellished their stories with borrowed information. In preparing this documentary, we recorded interviews with more than 24 people. All were carefully screened, their backgrounds checked. Many of them had never met. And yet, invariably, their stories matched. Each piece of the puzzle fit, and there was no evidence of collusion. Jack Rodden grew up in Roswell and still lives there. In 1947, his father, a professional photographer, was among those pursuing the story. Jack still remembers 3 cryptic words.
The day after, a day or two after the story was released that it was a weather balloon, I quizzed him about it. I want to know what was really going on, what happened. And he said, just 3 words, they killed it. He had the ability, when he wanted to say a lot in a very few words. And the words a lot of times could be taken more than one way. And I asked him, what do you mean, they killed the story? And he wouldn't deviate. He just said, they killed it. And I said, they kill someone? And he just said, they killed it. And I couldn't press it any further, so I didn't. But I didn't forget it either.
Frankie Rowe tried not to remember. She says threats to separate her from her family and send her to prison pushed memories of the incident deep into a shadowy corner of her mind. But years later, as parts of the story became public, Mrs. Rowe's memories came rushing back. The memories and the anger. Now she believes the American public has a right to know everything, the whole story, even small pieces of it, like the pieces of metal she saw and touched.
And he pulled his hand out of his pocket, and he had a piece of the material wadded up in his hand in a little tiny ball, and when he dropped it on the table, it spread out like it was liquid or quicksilver, and there was not one wrinkle in that. And I do remember that we all did get to touch it. We all got to pick it up. You could bend it, it made no crinkle, no noise. It was very thin and it was very shiny, very silvery color. It was about maybe a foot square. And I have no idea what happened to it.
More than 40 years have passed since the crash. The government still sticks to the official explanation. The military is still stonewalling. However, in later years, a few cracks have begun to appear in that wall. Major Marcel would talk again to his son, telling him no, it definitely was not a weather balloon. And suddenly, in a supermarket, a retired Air Force officer would disclose to his wife an astonishing secret. But let's start with the story of Brownie. Melvin E. Brown was a sergeant with the 509th in New Mexico at the time of the crash. Later, he was transferred to England. He married an English woman, and following retirement, settled down with his family in a suburb near London. Over the years, on several occasions, he would tell his daughters bits and pieces of a curious story. But on his deathbed in 1982, Brownie gave up the rest of the secret and disclosed the number of a hidden bank account. There was no record of any trust fund, nor could the bank account number be traced. And yet, the family still wonders, is the money waiting for them somewhere? They wonder and remember what Brownie told them.
It's almost as if when he'd actually told the story, he wished he hadn't. All available men were grabbed. That's his actual words I'm saying here now that I can remember. All available men were grabbed. They all had to go out to the desert where a crashed saucer had come down. And they all had to stand guard duty around this site. They were told to look, but not look, not to take anything in. And him and this other guy did look, and they lifted up the covers. And he did say that these trucks were coveralls. I don't know what he meant by that. It must have been some sort of truck with a cover. He lifted up, him and this other guy both lifted up the cover and saw, I say 2 bodies, but my sister remembers him as saying 3. We disagree on that. They saw these bodies, and they were about 4 foot tall, no more than that, maybe even less. Much larger heads than we have, slanted eyes, yellowish skin.
Far from London, in Lincoln County, New Mexico, we searched for an elusive witness with an even stranger story. We found him living elsewhere and had promised not to disclose his whereabouts. His name is Glenn Dennis. In 1947, Mr. Dennis was a mortician, the manager of Ballard Funeral Home in Roswell, New Mexico.
Here in Roswell, on the afternoon of July 8th, a local mortuary began getting calls from the hospital at the airbase.
There were questions about the preservation of tissue and what specific chemicals would do to the tissue. And Clardy's Dairy and Creamery in Roswell received an order for a large quantity of dry ice. After 4 or 5 calls to the mortuary, the mortician decided there must have been a fatal crash at the airbase.
That was the beginning of the most remarkable story connected with the Roswell crash. This is the gentleman to whom we have referred, the mortician, Glenn Dennis. In 1947, he was manager of Ballard Funeral Home in Roswell. Those telephone calls from the base hospital on July 8th started a chain of events leading to threats against his own life and the reported death of a close friend. Let's go back now to the afternoon of July 8th.
Then the next call I got, probably in 30-45 minutes later, he was asking me then about our preparations and what we did preparing the bodies that had been laying out in the elements, or that, some badly decomposed bodies, or how we treated the burnt bodies, otherwise very traumatic cases, and what our procedure was on that. Then the next question was, well, what would you do where you wouldn't change any of the chemical contents, you wouldn't destroy any of the blood, you wouldn't destroy anything that might be very important later on, down the road? What would your process and what you do and the chemicals that you use, would that change the blood contents and everything? I knew at the time that there was something that probably happened. I thought maybe it was something that they weren't ready to release, or there might be some VIP or something they didn't want. But I mean, I had no idea what it was. But I told him at the time, I said, I can come out and I can help you if you have that. And he said, no, this is for future, in case this should happen in the future. He said, this is something we need to know so we'll know how to proceed.
Questions about chemicals, tissue, and the preservation of blood, as well as other body fluids. Very strange questions. If doctors at the base were examining the remains at the time of those telephone calls, it follows that by July 8th, the bodies had been removed from the second crash site to the base hospital. That would match key points in the story told by Sergeant Brown.
Not only that, but Glenn Dennis' story tends to corroborate the story told by witness Frankie Rowe.
Now, he felt that the one that was alive, he said later that it was taken out to the base hospital. And a friend of ours, her husband was working out there at the time, and he saw the one person walk in.
Later that same afternoon, Glenn Dennis drove an injured airman to the base hospital following a minor automobile accident. Walking into the emergency room, Dennis saw debris in the back of a parked Army ambulance.
What I noticed that was so unusual about that was probably 3 inches, maybe around 3 inches, but it was kind of going along the contour of the wreckage. And at the time, after I got back, I got to thinking about this and what the border looked like, and it kind of reminded me of an Egyptian inscriptions of figures and whatever.
Now another piece in our jigsaw puzzle drops into place. It appears doctors were continuing their examinations of the bodies as Mr. Dennis entered the emergency room. Assisting them was a nurse, whom he describes as a close friend.
One of the nurses, lieutenant nurses that I was acquainted with very well, she was very excited, and she said, "How did you get in here? What are you doing here? And get out immediately or you're going to get in a lot of trouble." She said, "Get out of here as fast as you can."
The nurse disappeared into another room, presumably where the examination was still in progress. But serious trouble was in store for Glenn Dennis, the result of a chance remark to an officer who stopped him as he was leaving.
But I said, "It looks like you've had a crash." I said, "I see some debris in the ambulances there." And that's probably where I really got in trouble right there. And he said, "Well, just a moment." And then he went to the door and he motioned for somebody, and about that time there was 2 MPs that came out. And he said, "Get this man out here, get him out here as fast as you can get him out of here." And then we were starting down the hall, and then there was a man that we heard a voice said, "I'm not through with that SOB yet," said, "Bring him back."
Mr. Dennis says suddenly he was rushed into a room where he was confronted by 2 men he had never seen before, an Army sergeant and a captain with red hair. A sharp exchange followed, in which Dennis says both men threatened to kill him.
The captain told me, the red-headed captain told me, he said, "There was no crash here, you did not see anything," and he said, "You don't go into town, you don't tell anybody anything that you saw anything or anything else. He said, if you do, you will get in real serious trouble." Well, I was a little agitated because I didn't like the name he called me to start with. And I informed him, I said, "Look, I'm a civilian, you can't do a damn thing to me, and as far as I'm concerned, you can go to hell." And that was the exact words that I told him, and I remember it very clearly. And then the black sergeant, he said, "Oh, don't kid yourself, young man." He said, "Somebody be picking your bones out of the sand."
Army Air Force Captain O.W. Henderson kept his mouth shut for a long time. He didn't go public until he learned that some of the others had broken their silence. He was retired by then and living in California.
It had been rumored for years that one of the pilots on one of the flights out of Roswell had actually seen the bodies. But the rumor did not become a reality until 1982, when Pappy Henderson finally spoke out. He told his wife, "I've been dying to tell you for years."
We were in the grocery store in San Diego where we had lived for many years, and we were at the checkout stand, and here was a paper, the Globe, I believe it was. Here was all of the story about it. In fact, I still have the papers here. And he said, he took a look and he said, "I've been wanting to tell you about this for years. I guess if they're putting in the papers now, it's no longer a top secret." And he said, he bought the papers, and we went to the car, and he said, "Read those." And I read the article, and he said, "It's a true story." He said, "Not only did I know about it, but I'm the pilot that took the crashed saucer to Dayton, Ohio." I was astonished, and if it hadn't been Pappy telling me, I probably wouldn't have believed it. But he was very confident, and he was always very truthful and straightforward. So I believed him. But in those days, if you said you'd seen a spacecraft or a flying saucer, you were put in the annals of a nut. So we didn't say much about this. But years before, when people would ask him what he thought about flying saucers, his answer was, "There's something to it."
We may never identify and confirm all the witnesses, but let's review the ones we've heard about so far. These are people who claim they saw bodies of humanoid creatures killed in the Roswell crash. We have an Army pilot, a civil engineer, an archaeologist, and a sergeant who peeked under a tarp. Two of our purported witnesses allegedly made deathbed statements. The woman dying of cancer told her story to a nurse at a hospital in Florida. And for the last 4 days of his life, Sergeant Melvin Brown talked about the crash, insisting the bodies were real and the weather balloon story was a lie.
What on the earth could he have done that he would have been so worried about on his deathbed? Because he was worried about it. I mean, he was mentioning this place in his sleep and sort of shaking his head and nodding and arguing in his sleep about it and mentioning it. He was worried about it. Whatever it was, he was really worried. And this is what makes me angry. It makes me rather bitter to think that, all right, I don't know, UFOs, alien bodies, I don't know what the truth is. All I know is that if my dad said so, then that's it. He wouldn't have lied.
During our investigation of the Roswell crash, we located a witness who claimed to have watched a bright light cross the sky and fall to Earth the night of July 2nd, 1947. His name is William Woody, and he still lives on the same small farm outside Roswell, New Mexico, where, as a boy, he says he and his father watched a burning light slowly flying northwest toward the desert.
My dad looked up and said, "My God, what's that bright light there?" And we got to looking, and it looked like a falling star at that time, but we got to checking it, and it was much larger, much closer. And we looked at the picture of it. Well, it just showed much larger and much closer, and just a large stream of white light with a reddish tail on it.
Woody's father drove out to the desert several days later, trying to find the spot where the light came down. Woody went along, but they found the roads blocked off by military guards.
No, they had several of the side roads, which there's not, in that area, not too many access roads off, which there's many more now than there was back in that time. But every one that we come to, they had a security set up so you wouldn't go off in that area to the left-hand side of the road going north.
Far out in the desert, at both crash sites, teams of soldiers were hard at work, cleaning up debris and hauling it away in trucks. A very large operation indeed for the alleged recovery of a weather balloon. How strange it seems that 9 airplanes and numerous crates and packages marked top secret would be needed to transport what was left of a weather balloon. One flight on the 6th of July moved debris from Roswell to 8th Air Force Headquarters and on to Washington, D.C. July 8th, Roswell to Wright Field near Dayton, Ohio, which is now Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. That same day, a plane arrived in Roswell from Washington. The crew picked up a sealed box containing debris. And another flight was flown from Roswell to Fort Worth, all on the 8th of July. The day after General Ramey's news conference, special flights were still going out. 3 on the 9th of July to Los Alamos. 1 more that day from Roswell to Fort Worth. And on the 10th, a flight departed Wright Field in Ohio for an unknown destination.
Apparently, debris was being shipped out from Roswell as rapidly as it could be recovered and brought to the base. But what about the bodies? What happened to them?
We can trace the recovery of the bodies from the actual crash site to the base hospital at Roswell. The pathologist, Dr. Johnson, who did the preliminary examination of the bodies, filed a report, a preliminary autopsy report, of which we have no records. In fact, all the records from Roswell went to Washington. No paper trail whatsoever have we been able to uncover from Roswell.
Dr. Johnson is now deceased, but in attempting to research his background, Don and Kevin made a startling discovery. All records of the late doctor's military service, indeed most of his career, had vanished.
According to the ABMS Medical Compendium of Medical Specialists, Dr. Johnson completed his internship in 1946. Yet in 1947, when we can document his being at Roswell, there is absolutely no mention of that fact. In 1948, he is listed as a pathologist practicing in Galveston. In 1949, until going into private practice, he is listed at numerous hospitals throughout the country. Each hospital that we contacted has absolutely no records of Dr. Johnson being on staff.
If an autopsy was performed on one or more of the bodies, no one has ever been able to find the report, not even using the Freedom of Information Act. However, this man claims to have spoken with a doctor who dissected the alien bodies.
The medical person he had reference to had information about the anatomy of the alien, the dead alien that was taken from a crashed disc.
He is Leonard Stringfield, the retired marketing director of a large chemical company. Stringfield has devoted more than 20 years to investigating and writing about UFO phenomena. He specializes in suspected crashes and retrievals.
The head is large, very large by human proportion. There is no hair follicles. There are no earlobes. There is no nose as we have as humans. The mouth is just a slit or an orifice which goes in about approximately an inch, membranous, which leads to no digestive tract or alimentary system. There were no red cells, no lymphocytes. There were no striata muscles in the body. There was an atria, or a heart, the pumping station, so to speak, for the colorless liquid, which is, in a sense, blood.
After the Roswell crash, dozens of soldiers and others connected with the military were pressured never, under any circumstances, ever to speak of the incident again. Accounts surfacing only now, more than 40 years later, indicate the tactics used to enforce secrecy were ruthless. Which brings us back to the witness we mentioned just a few moments ago, the friend of the mortician, the Army nurse.
And this was a young second lieutenant, had only been in the service less than 3 months and commissioned less than 3 months. Very deeply religious lady. She was born and raised in a very strict Catholic family, attended all the private Catholic schools, preschool and high schools, and her folks wanted her to become a nun, but she...
At Mr. Dennis' request, we've agreed not to use her real name, but we will call the nurse Judy. Sensitive and deeply religious. What she saw in the examining room July 8th, 1947, took Judy to the brink of hysteria.
And she said, "I can't believe what I've just seen." She said, "This was the most horrible thing I've ever seen in my life." She was going into this examination room that was across the hall. She was going in to get some supplies, and when she walked in the door, there was 2 doctors there. And she noticed a horrible smell immediately. But she saw these 2 doctors, and they said, "We need you." She started out the door and said, "You stay here, we've got to have you." And what it was, they were examining, she told me, 3 bodies, foreign bodies. And she said 2 of them were very mutilated.
According to Mr. Dennis, Judy and both doctors became ill from the stench of the bodies as they continued to examine them. Judy was still not well the following day when Glenn met her for lunch at the officers' club. But he was more disturbed by her emotional state.
I knew she was almost in a state of shock, because she said it was so gruesome and so horrible, and she would just, almost grab her head, and it looked like she was just going into total shock.
We should note here that Glenn's concern for Judy was serious. Marriage had been discussed, but all of that was about to change forever. He never dreamed what lay in store for Judy as she began to describe what she had seen.
She had drawn me just a little the night before. She had a description of an arm that was that she had drawn, and then the anatomy of the arm, which was different from ours. There was only 4 fingers on the hand. Didn't have a thumb to it. Only 4 very slim, fragile little fingers. But when they turned one of the hands over, they noticed at the end of the fingers there was little pads on each one of the 4 fingers there. And it looked to them like they were like little suction cups. They were little hollowed out areas that looked kind of like a suction cup. The heads on these individuals were much larger, somewhat larger than the human head would be. The eyes were very sunken. The nose was there wasn't a convex or anything. The nose was very concave. with only 2 little orifices. The ears, there was no ear. There only might be 2 little orifices on the side, but very small little lobes that looked like they might function, they might close maybe or whatever, but they was very small. Nothing resembled an ear on a human anatomy at all.
Not touching their food, they continued to talk. But for Judy and Glenn, time was running out.
She never touched her food at all, we never, I think I drank my Coke, but I was so, I thought, my God, this was something else, and I don't know that I ever ate my food either, but that was, then she said, I've got to go back to the barracks. He said, I am deathly ill, and I've got to go back to the barracks, and then that was the last time I ever saw her.
Call it stick and carrot. Apparently, counterintelligence agents and ranking officers used both threats and money. The archaeologists were intimidated, told the government would find and punish them if they ever talked, and indeed none did, with the possible exception of the cancer patient on her deathbed in Florida. Mac Brazel had not yet heard the Korean War term brainwashed, but might have used it to describe the days and nights he spent as a virtual captive, being interrogated, examined, and forced to change his story. But one thing more, Mac's friends, the Proctors, remember he came back from Roswell driving a new pickup truck.
Yeah, I think maybe he did come back with a pickup truck when he came back. And we always wondered if he didn't get a reward.
And suddenly, the ranch hand described by those who knew him as dirt poor had money for a meat locker in Las Cruces and a new house.
When they brought Mac down and kept him a few days, and then he came back, and he wouldn't talk about it, but we always wondered if he got a reward, because it wasn't long after that until he went to Alamogordo and put in a locker plant. And back then, I don't know what it would cost to put it in a locker plant, because it's lots of individual boxes and things. It's, a lot of freezing units. So I don't know what it would have cost, but I think it would have cost more than he got on his wages.
Threats and rewards and continuing surveillance. Mac Brazel's son Bill had his own collection of small pieces of debris until he talked about them at a bar in Corona. The next day, military officers appeared on his doorstep and confiscated the pieces, all of them. The sun has set on many secrets of the old Roswell Army airfield. For example, few people know the bomber that dropped atomic destruction on Hiroshima once was hangared at Roswell. Military security is a fact of life. We have been told not only soldiers but civilian firemen worked at the crash sites. Apparently, some got the carrot, some got the stick, including Frankie Rowe's father, who remained silent but angry for the rest of his life.
And he was very angry for a long time about that the government could do this, that they could just totally suppress something that actually happened. And he knew that it happened. He had seen them.
Confidential military sources told our researchers that more than a dozen military policemen who guarded the crash site were paid $10,000 apiece, a very large carrot in 1947. Which brings us from the New Mexico desert back to London and the family of the late Sergeant Brown. Remember, as he lay dying, Brownie talked about a special bank account.
My 2 brother-in-laws and a close family friend was sitting with him, and he told them that he had a trust fund in a place called Roswell, New Mexico, and that he had a lot of money there, and that he'd done something hush-hush for Uncle Sam. And they all made fun of him. They all started saying, "Oh, Brownie, what did you do, rob a bank or something?" At which point he changed his tune completely and got most angry and said, "I've never done a thing wrong for my country." He said, I want you to find this money, and I want you to get it for Mum.
But the money was never found. Sergeant Brown's wife, Ada, insists he was not the kind of man to make up stories. And she remembers that in those final days, his mind was clear.
My husband really knew that he was going to die,
because he said all his goodbyes. He said his goodbye to me, and he said his goodbye to his kids, and
Instead of money, Sergeant Brown got a plaque, a generic letter of commendation from President Reagan.
I think he deserved a wee bit more than that. That made me angry when that came. That came about a year after he died. What I should say on there is, we are very sorry that we made your dad suffer all those years. If they were to say sorry, I'd leave it. Be fine. But that's what I want. I want them to say, yes, it did happen. I'm sorry your dad had to carry that secret all those years. I'm sorry he couldn't die in peace. I'm sorry he had to be laying in bed dying and trying to relate a story that he was, even while he was dying, he was too scared to talk about something that happened at this place in Roswell, New Mexico. And what makes me even more angrier is when you get somebody like Philip Klass on television talking about a weather balloon. What do they think, my dad was crazy?
The letter that I had sent to her with the APO number was returned to me, and on the envelope it said return to sender, and then it had a big red print said deceased.
In July, the turbulence caused by the Roswell crash had settled. Most of the media bought the official explanation, and most of the public had forgotten the incident. It was nothing but a weather balloon. Or was it? If you don't think this looks like a flying saucer, would you believe a meteorite? Apparently the government did, because next they sent an expert on meteorites to investigate. They sent him to this area, about 5 miles from the debris field, to look at that circle in the pasture where the sand had been melted to glass. Dr. Lincoln La Paz of the University of New Mexico was a noted authority on meteorites and their recovery. He had worked on dozens of top-secret assignments, including the Manhattan Project. About 2 months after the crash, Dr. Lincoln La Paz was asked to calculate the speed and trajectory of whatever it was that came down out here. La Paz had not been told about the alleged recovery of bodies. After investigating, he concluded not a meteorite, but an aircraft had struck the ground. Given the heat and the speed, the doctor couldn't believe it came from Earth. He was convinced it must have been an unoccupied probe from another planet. The key word is convinced. 1 year later, Dr. La Paz had not changed his mind. This from former counterintelligence agent Louis Rickett, who remembered a conversation with La Paz in September of 1948.
If all the government recovered was a weather balloon, why was it still investigating the crash 2 months later? Except for being torn, the weather balloon displayed by the general was virtually intact. Yet pieces of something were scattered 3/4 of a mile across the desert. Pieces of what? How could a veteran combat officer like Major Jesse Marcel fail to recognize a weather balloon?
On his return from Fort Worth, Marcel went to the intelligence office. There he ran into the counterintelligence officer who had prepared a report about the activities that had taken place at Roswell. Marcel asked to see a copy of the report and was told, no, you can't, it's classified. Marcel said, I outrank you, I want to see the report. And the counterintelligence officer responded, if you have a problem, take it up with Washington.
And last but not least, why use threats, bribes, and loyalty oaths to keep secret a weather balloon already displayed to newspaper photographers?
There's an adage worth repeating here. They say, if it looks like a duck, if it quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck. We can't say for sure, but what happened in Roswell certainly looks and sounds like a cover-up.
If there is a hidden answer to this riddle, then the secret may not have been kept without a price. There is the matter of 3 lives and the curious circumstances under which those lives were lost. Now we return to Glenn Dennis and the story of his friend Judy, the Army nurse. Remember, it was Judy who told Glenn she assisted 2 doctors examining bodies of humanoid creatures brought to the base hospital. According to Mr. Dennis, she described the bodies in detail and even drew sketches. After lunch with Glenn, Judy left the officers' club and vanished.
The next day, I called out. I wanted to see how she was doing and how she was feeling. And of course, you know, by that time I was really fascinated by what was going on, and I was so curious. I wanted, you know, maybe she'd feel like talking a little more about it. But I was really concerned on what was happening to her. And they told me that she wasn't working, that she was unavailable that day. And so the next day I made the call again. I made 2 or 3 calls the next day. And it was also, she was still unavailable. Then the third day I called and they said that she'd been transferred out. And they didn't know where, but she was no longer there at the air base.
Transferred without a word, no goodbyes, and no explanations. Judy was a second lieutenant with less than 4 months at Roswell, her first duty assignment. For days, Glenn kept asking questions, but got no answers.
Well, then about maybe 10 days to 2 weeks or so later, I get a letter from her in the mail addressed to the funeral home. And all it was just inside with just a note said, I can't write, I don't have time to write now, but here's an APO number that you can send me the mail to. And that was all that was in the envelope. There wasn't anything else.
APO numbers are used by the military to forward mail to American servicemen and women without disclosing their locations. But through friends at the base, Glenn quickly learned the APO number sent by Judy meant that her letter originated in England. He replied immediately, then waited.
Probably 2 weeks, or maybe it was at least 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks later, the letter that I had sent to her with the APO number was returned to me, and on the envelope it said return to sender, and then it had a big red print said deceased. And that was the last time I heard or, you know, even thought about it. And then about every time I'd go to the base too, sometimes we wouldn't go there for a week or two on emergencies or whatever, but 2 or 3 weeks or so later I would go out to base and I said, has anyone heard from the lieutenant? And one of the nurses said, well, the rumor is that she is in England. Well, in her note, she also told me, she said, I am in London. And then the nurses told me that she was in London. The rumor is that she was on maneuvers on a training mission with 5 other nurses, and they went down on a plane. And they understand the rumor was that they were all killed in a plane crash.
Later on, another key person in the Roswell mystery was reported killed in a plane crash. He was Lieutenant Colonel Payne Jennings, executive officer of the 509th Bomb Group. And finally, there was the curious accident which claimed the life of a soldier believed to have worked at one of the crash sites.
We have information concerning a heavy equipment operator, for example, that was found crushed to death by his own vehicle, with his unscathed glasses found 100 feet from the site.
The Roswell crash. Even after years of research, 100 questions still come to mind, most without answers. It's not our purpose to prove or disprove this story, only to present those facts and witnesses we could find and let you decide. Somewhere there is tangible evidence, a piece of metal, a scrap of fabric, or one more witness who remembers. Perhaps that witness is you. We applaud the courage of those who come forward in this documentary to speak for the record. We believe, as they do, that the time is now to unlock the truth, and that the United States government holds the key.
It is frightening now when I think about it. I can't believe that I could have forgotten as much as I did.
I mean, it's crazy. But yeah, I'm bitter. I'm angry. I don't give monkeys about the bodies and the... I mean, what I want to find out is why. All right, they must have had a good reason, obviously, for doing it. But I don't know. I can't see that it is that important anymore, that it has to be covered up.
You know, I think it's time they wash your linen, at least give the people an explanation of why we shouldn't talk about it in the first place if it was a national security item, or, I mean, you know, just a reason why everyone should keep this and why they should keep covering it up. I think they owe the American people an explanation why this happened, I mean, why they're not doing this. And let us know, and then the people know to either keep their mouth shut or go on their way.
After almost 50 years, there is still no change in the official story. But whether a spaceship did or did not crash in New Mexico, one thing is perfectly clear. Details of the incident have been wrapped for decades in layer upon layer of secrecy, which raises the most tantalizing question of all. Why? Would proof of intelligent life on another planet destroy this civilization, wreck the edifice of science, and undermine religion? Is that what they fear? Centuries ago, those same fears motivated enemies of Copernicus and Galileo, who revealed a simple truth every schoolboy knows today, that the sun is the center of our solar system, and Earth revolves around it. Or is there something more? Could the visitors, if there are visitors, be predators, indifferent to human life or human suffering? Have our leaders been shielding us from a terrible truth? Even so, what has all the secret-keeping bought us? A few decades of false complacency? Well, things are different now. As we wind down the 20th century, we have reached the end of innocence. People are demanding the truth, and yet it is a truth that could rob us. We may never again be certain we're dominant here on Earth. Indeed, not even certain we are here alone.